people, Captain Blade J52 here with another video for Space Engineers this go around. About 4 or 5 days ago at the time of recording this video, I had released a different one that was a partial video response to Diggrok and to the heat management system that was proposed for Space Engineers 2 and was marked as under consideration on the Keen Software House website. In Diggrok's original video and a later reply that he gave me in the comments section of my video after he saw it, he talked briefly about how he made that video on heat management as a follow-up to some comments and concerns that were raised on an even earlier video of his where he talked about combat balance in Space Engineers 2. And in that video, he goes over some of the ways that he believed combat balance could potentially be changed for the better, as well as touching on a feature that I've wanted to see for a while in Space Engineers, which is energy shields, along with going over some of Keen's other concerns for the new game. And after Diggrok had saw my video, I was invited to join his Discord, where I've been able to have some pretty cool debates with people over there so far, and we've been able to go over some of our collective concerns about Space Engineers 2, and debate a little bit about how to best resolve some of them. As part of those debates, I had mentioned that I was going to be doing a follow-up to my own video addressing Diggrok's first video on combat balance. So I'm kind of going in backwards order compared to the way he did it, which is a little bit funny to me in a way. But comedy aside, I want to address some of the concerns that he raised about combat and that others raised about the game as a whole. So for this video, we're going to be talking about combat balance and potentially adding energy shields as a feature to Space Engineers 2, since that was something that Diggrok dedicated a fairly large portion of his video to, and that subject. We're going to be breaking down Diggrok's video on possible improvements to survival and Almagest, and hopefully how to make everything better. We're going to look at some of the pros and cons of various proposals that he and others made, along with giving some of my thoughts on where we agree and some on where we disagree. As a quick little caveat, as the development of Space Engineers 2 progresses, some of my thoughts in this video could end up changing. Right now, we don't know what we don't know, so kind of keep that in your back pocket, especially if you're seeing this long after the fact. Some of my background for modding and game development is I came to the Space Engineers franchise in late 2015 to early 2016 time, but I didn't actively start playing on the regular until sometime in 2016 after I had bought the game and all that stuff. I began modding Space Engineers in 2017 with my Galdax thrusters, which was the first of my mods, to address some of the complaints around hydrogen thrusters at the time that I had, which later spawned several other mods to do with armor, gyros, and even a full-on rebalance. I've been creating content for other games for a little over 20 years now. I'm not a Keen dev, as cool as that would be. Now, some of my more successful creations were maps and levels for Time Splitter's Future Perfect, which were EA recommended downloads for several weeks at the time, whenever some of them hit it big. I've also created several other levels and mods for games like Star Trek Armada 2, among many other games, and now also, of course, for Space Engineers. While I'm not the most prolific modder in SE, I've got a couple hundred hours into modding the game at this point, and I like to think I know a thing or two. Now, there's always more to learn and more to discover in the aspect of modding, so that is an ongoing process, but anyway, I digress. Getting into some of the first concerns that Diggrok goes over are some of Keen's issues with things like surprise attacks and one-shots, as well as cockpits getting one-shot. So, for surprise attacks and one-shots, Diggrok mentions some of the dev diaries and some of the statements they've gave on other videos and streams and such about how Keen wants to avoid sudden one-shot kills and give players more time to react. And in one of the dev diaries in particular, they talk a little bit about how they want fights to last ideally a couple of minutes instead of always ending in just a couple of seconds. And a comment that's very insightful that I 100% agree with Diggrok on is how whenever stuff like that happens with surprise attacks and one-shots, the advantage is pretty much always with the attacker. And we're going to address that a little more in just a minute. But getting to cockpits being one-shot, Keen has issues with how often that happens in Space Engineers 1 right now, and how a single hit can sometimes destroy a cockpit and end a fight instantly. And they don't want to repeat that mistake for SE2. And they're looking for ways to prevent that kind of thing or reduce the chances of it happening, whether that's through the use of energy shields, better armor, better cockpits, or potentially other durability mechanics and layers to hopefully give players more time to react. And they talk about how they don't want combat to be slower just for the sake of having slower combat, but ideally they want to slow it down to make it more interesting and more fair to people. Well, some of my thoughts on this are that when it comes to surprise attacks, they should still be possible, though they shouldn't be an almost always guaranteed success like they can be now. I agree with Diggrok that as the game sits right now, the advantage is pretty much always or almost always with the attacker, and that just should not be the case. There's times that I expect the attacker to have an advantage, certainly, such as attacking a less prepared or less advanced target. However, that alone should not always guarantee success. People should have various ways to sniff around for people that would try to attack them in game and have more early warning kind of systems than we have now. If people choose not to use any of those early warning detection methods, then yeah, attackers should absolutely have an advantage because those people have chosen to leave themselves more vulnerable. I agree with Merrick and Diggrok that preparation should matter, and a properly prepared surprise attack that involves scouting, mapping defenses, and so forth should have a higher chance of success than one that's just going in blind. As far as the duration of fights go, being a couple of minutes versus a couple of seconds, depending on the grids fighting it out, such as what kind of armor they're bringing to the table, the actions of the pilot, and tactics being used, and so forth, there are times when a fight should only last a few seconds. If two engineers of equal skill and build quality are fighting it out, then the fight should last a couple of minutes at least, ideally. That much I'll agree with. If one engineer, on the other hand, drastically outclasses the other in terms of skill and potentially build quality on top of that, then I expect that the fight isn't going to last nearly as long as it would otherwise. The general rule of thumb that I'm seeing is that most fights of equal skill and build quality should last longer than a few seconds, barring certain limited exceptions. Quantity of combat doesn't automatically equate to quality of combat. There needs to be a balance, which is what Keen is trying to find. For cockpits being one-shot, this is something that should actually be expected within reason, depending on what is hitting the cockpit. Now, if this is something that's a shell the size of Texas, splatting into a little tiny fighter cockpit, or that cockpit is slamming into the ground or something else at the speed of Mach stupid, then it should absolutely eat more damage than a lesser scenario. Likewise, if a cockpit is hanging onto a grid by just a thread or a super thin beam, then I'm going to expect that cockpit to get disabled a lot easier because it's not, bolted on as well as it should be essentially. A cockpit's getting knocked out in a single hit shouldn't be the norm to the point that it happens every single time, but it shouldn't be completely impossible either. In order to pull something like that off, it should take a decent amount of investment and effort required. And whenever cockpits are getting one-shot that often, that tells me that the durability versus weapon damage math is off and it needs to be adjusted for gameplay purposes. especially so smaller ships and stuff like fighters and so forth aren't rendered completely unplayable. Some of the things that Keen talks about is that they want players to have better ways to detect their enemies and it not be relegated to strictly visual spotting with, your eyeballs. It can be various ways such as scanners and sensor types. And some of the things they talk about is how this could potentially open the door for infiltration play, and they even tease hacking in one of the dev diaries that Diggrok examines, which could potentially be good or bad depending on how they do it, but that's another can of worms that we'll get to in a little bit. Now, in introducing new sensor types, Keen talks about how they want to introduce countermeasures for the defenders to balance things out. They want to give us some better surveillance systems, detection blocks, hacking protection if that becomes a thing, and Diggrok talks about how certain sensors and radars could have different effectiveness levels, which is something I kind of agree with. An example that he gives is a smaller ship having less of a radar profile, or even potentially being invisible to radar, depending on what it's made of, making it harder to detect, but perhaps being able to detect that ship via heat signature, even though it's invisible to radar. And he mentions how different sensors and types could have various strengths and weaknesses. So, one of the big ones is heat signature detection. Now, I'm not a fan of heat management being added to the game currently due to a lot of the reasons I gave in the previous video. I'm not going to go over every single one of them here, but basically in a nutshell, I personally feel that the heat management proposal isn't as fleshed out as it needs to be, such as there's not enough focus on the positive benefits that it would grant, and as such, to me, the proposal is incomplete. There's not enough focus on what positives I'm going to get to it, and currently it would require way too much sacrifice in the realm of build freedom, and me to give up too much in that area for too little return on investment. Kind of like expecting me to invest $500 in something but only get like $200 worth of value back. Like, I'm not going to do that, sorry. Now, I will say though, for the sake of discussion regarding sensors and for the heat signature detection for this video, I'm going to assume that some variant of heat management exists and that it's been implemented. For heat signature detection, I would imagine that it's going to pick up heat sources at a medium to shorter range, which it would be in line with real-life variants. Now, its function would be mainly to tell you if something is super hot or if it's not, and it can give you a rough outline of the heat signature that it's detecting, similar to FLIR systems used by military or police in real life. Now, if you're not familiar with FLIR systems, they're forward-looking infrared cameras, and it can be a thing that is able to differentiate temperatures in real life and also in game, and it can give you a rough idea of the potential shape of an object, but it may not always give you the exact details. But for gameplay purposes, I would imagine it's going to give you just enough info for you to get an idea of whether something is running warm due to a lot of power being used, maybe thruster burn, or whether it's just a natural temperature difference due to being exposed to the sun, or perhaps a different weather exposure once you've acquired the target. Some other different sensor types that could be utilized is radar and sonar. In real life, radar and sonar, they send out radio or sound waves respectively, depending on what it is, and they can give you information about the location and shape of an object based on the nature of the signal that that wave gives them whenever it bounces back off of the object. Now, these sensor types would be medium to longer range, since they have a lot longer range than FLIR type systems in real life, and that would just make sense to translate it to that way in game. Now, simply put, the sonar and the radar would tell you if something is out there, maybe give you a little bit of information on the shape of an object. Now, the downside to sensors like this in real life, and I would imagine in game as well, is that not everything is always going to be as it appears. In real life, there's been instances where a diver is scanning a lake or looking for stuff, in the ocean, and they see what looks like maybe a car underwater or a piece of airplane debris or a shipwreck, and then they go to dive down under the water to check that object out more closely, and they discover it's actually a natural formation. So that's something to kind of keep in mind with that. Now, I would also imagine, of course, that sonar would be limited to planets and underwater, because duh. Some of the other sensor types that we could potentially see would be motion sensors, which would be a shorter range sensor that you can use to detect motion in certain areas and give yourself an alert, like we have in real life for certain alarm systems and such. Speaking of surveillance, I would imagine that perhaps we could have, run-of-the-mill mounted cameras, similar to what we've got in real life, but except a game-type version for it. For that matter, they could even repurpose a modified, spotlight model into a camera. Now, it could be placed in an area where we're able to access the feed via terminal at any time we want, pan around the room, maybe even zoom in on certain stuff, and I would imagine a zoom quality of around 4 to 8 times, with that, quantity being up for discussion, of course. Now, another type of sensor that I've not seen anybody talk about, but I think could potentially be useful, it would be a shorter range optional sensor that can detect power coming from an object and how much, such as getting a rough readout of what power generation something is putting out, whether it's like, say, is it like 100 kilowatts, 100 megawatts, are we talking 100 gigawatts? God help you if you need that much energy, but I digress. Now, to give some rough numbers to quantify what I'm talking about when I say short range, medium range, and so forth, for me, whenever I think short range in terms of stuff like this, I'm thinking perhaps, say, 25 kilometers and less for a short range. Medium range would be 25 to 50, long range would be 50 to 75 and higher. And of course, we can adjust these range numbers up or down depending on render distance versus speed and individual server goals and so forth. Those don't have to be set perfectly in stone. So, to reiterate really quickly again, Keenan mentioned, of course, how they want us to be able to have ways to detect enemies and not just visual spotting, and how we could have various types of sensors. But one of the things that Diggrok had mentioned, of course, was different effectiveness levels of various sensors. And one of the other sensor types that I would want to see, of course, is the generic sensor type, like we have now. I would want to see better variants of that. In Space Engineers 1, the sensors detect a variety of different factors, such as small ships and blocks, large ships and blocks, stations, platforms, subgrids, asteroids, and floating objects and players. However, the downside to this is that it's limited to just 50 meters in range. If your goal is to have a early warning type system, that range kind of sucks, to put it bluntly. And I mean that with all due respect to Keen and anybody that may see that from there. So, to me, generic sensors could just have their range extended out a lot farther to be an even greater early warning system. Now, for me, I did this in Space Engineers 1 whenever I created my sensor array block for my 2125 era mod. Now, the sensor arrays, I have two variants. I've got one for the small grid, one for the large grid. The small grid variant, I gave it a maximum range of 4 kilometers, and then the large grid variant a range of 30 kilometers, respectively, at the time of this particular video. My goal with that was to allow me to somewhat emulate Star Trek style sensors, where you see like the Enterprise scanning, and maybe Worf tells them, hey Captain, I'm detecting such and such ship, and then he's able to get more information about it before they actually get there. Now, for the purposes of Space Engineers 2, I would place this in the shorter to medium range category and give it some basic functions pretty much like what we have now in Space Engineers 1, with the more specialized sensors like FLIR, radar, sonar, and so forth giving a lot more details than the generic sensors would. Now, for gameplay purposes, at least one sensor needs to be undodgeable, meaning it's always going to detect something. If the goal is to provide people with, early warning systems, that is. Now, the generic sensor would be the undodgeable one with its cost and its range. Well, it's both being a lot higher. About tripped over myself a little bit there. But if at least one sensor isn't undodgeable, then this defeats the purpose of having early warning systems. And I dare say that if regular sensors in SE1 had a variant with a much larger range from the start, then early warning wouldn't have been as much of an issue. And things like always seeing surprise attacks, surprise one-shots, and so forth. Instead of those things being a 10 out of 10 concern, they would have been more along a 5 out of 10 or maybe a 6 out of 10 concern in my book. I would also imagine that the various sensors could be paired with things like event controllers, sound blocks, or so forth to a degree. That way, depending on what's detected and what settings are being used, we could get different type of alerts. Now, one of the things that Keen talks a little bit about and Diggrok mentions a little bit about, once again, is sensor balance. And Keen talks about how they want to include some countermeasures for defenders to balance things out with the new sensors. That way they're not just foolproof every single time. And Diggrok actually mentions a very big concern that I agree with him on, that I think gets missed a lot of times when we talk about sensors. And that is, we don't want them to have the super greatest range ever on planets. Because if you have a sensor, let's say, that's 150 kilometers, in range, if you land on a planet in Space Engineers 1 right now, you're going to be able to see where everything is at all times. And you're going to be able to see where everybody is, and that's just not fair to everybody. That's a little bit ridiculous. So, Diggrok mentions how there could be an extreme waning of range in the atmosphere, and how the sensors could have issues such as being blocked by terrain or asteroids, and how they could require line of sight, and how perhaps certain ones, namely like the heat signatures, might only show up whenever a ship is executing a burn with its thrusters. And some of the shorter range stuff for planets, just to quantify something I gave myself below, instead of them being the ranges that they were before, for short range on a planet, maybe it's 50 kilometers and less. If it's medium range, maybe it's 15 to 30. If it's long range, maybe it's 30 to 50 and higher. Again, those numbers can be adjusted up or down depending on a lot of factors like render distance, speed, server goals, and so forth. And those numbers are purely just to quantify for sake of discussion. But getting into server balance a little bit more, or sensor balance, sorry, instead of servers, it's kind of late as I recorded this, early in the morning, screwed up sleep schedule, all that stuff, so sorry if I trip over myself a few times. But anyway, getting back into it now, sensor balance would have to be cautious, because while sensors can allow players an early warning type of system, they can also be used by toxic players to find potential victims, so we want to avoid that as much as possible too. Now, some of the weaknesses that I see with sensors, and part of why there needs to be at least one undodgeable sensor, is because for heat sensors like FLIR and that kind of stuff, if somebody is able to fully conceal their heat signature, then that just makes the FLIR sensor useless. Likewise for radar and sonar. If an object has radar absorbing or scattering material, that they're made out of, or some kind of object on board, or the wave is blocked by another object, then the radar or the sonar isn't going to help you any. Likewise, there's certain things that can deflect the various detection waves sent out by motion sensors. Or if you move like really, really slow, even though it's like harder than crap to do, especially if you want a good example of that, see that Mythbusters episode they did for an example of that. But point being for motion sensors is they can still be beaten too. Likewise, your power signature detection. If the object is moving unpowered or at a super low power state, might not even pick it up. For surveillance cameras, the downside to them is you're only shown what's in a given area. If an object is too far away to be seen, then it's not going to help you. And it's kind of like monitoring an area with like a telescope and that kind of stuff. It's really just an aid in visual scanning. So, again, I agree with Diggrok that planetary balance of sensors would be another major concern, and you don't want people to just automatically know where everyone is on a planet all the time just by putting a single sensor up. So I would imagine that heat sensors, radar, sonar, and all that stuff will be blocked by terrain that, of course, naturally absorbs signals, especially depending on how far down an object is. Generic sensors would still be undodgeable, even on planets, in my book. The only thing is that the range would be reduced to keep it in line with the other sensors. And I actually gave slightly less, or slightly different numbers here. I realize I screwed my graphic up a little bit. But for like short range stuff, say 15 kilometers and less. For medium range, 15 to 30. And long range is 30 to 40. Like I say, I realize I screwed my graphic up for the long range on the one down here, so ignore this little part and pay attention to this one, at least for this slide. So, depending on overall final size of the planets, this effect, of course, again, could be dialed up or down as far as its effect on the sensors, or maybe you could have a slider done to dial those ranges up or down depending on the individual server goals. And of course, I would imagine that the final numbers could be debated. Current values for planets, of course, that I've got right here assume a 40% debuff in Atmo. And of course, again, that could be modded and so forth. Overall, the better detection would give more power to the players to prepare a proper response, or make it run for it, or maybe even negotiate their way out of a conflict, which I agree that's some potential scenarios that we could see. Now, another feature that Diggrok brings up, which is something I touched base on in the previous video, is a cruise speed and temporary boost that he talks about. You can see some examples of what he means here. So he talks about a boost system that would, in his personal opinion, create more dynamic pursuits, potentially allow small, faster ships, to potentially catch up to or evade larger ships. It's could potentially, as far as getting that temporary boost, give people a reason to use more fuel and potentially add to story scenarios. So he touches base on it a little bit with this kind of cheapo summary, I guess. So he mentions the temporary speed boost could be used to allow players to temporarily exceed the speed limit of the game to either potentially close the gap between a foe or lose said foe. Smaller ships would get more benefit and be able to get more boost than the larger ships due to thrust to weight ratios being better. And he mentions how bigger ships could also have a slightly less top cruise speed than the smaller ones, and how this could simulate real life thrust to weight ratios having better acceleration. So, in my previous video, I had mentioned how a boost tank could be limited by having something akin to a nitrous tank, like you may see some of these drag racers or street racers use to give themselves a little bit of a boost where that stuff is legal. And the way I would picture it in game is whenever that boost tank, has its energy or fuel depleted, whatever form it takes, from the ship boosting, it has to wait until that tank fills up again a little bit more to be able to execute the effect. And it would be kind of like an optional afterburner that they could use on their ship or not. Now, some of the concerns with this as well is that exceeding the speed limit comes with its own dangers. In Space Engineers, the speed limit is designed to avoid issues of things like phasing through an object because the game doesn't have time to properly calculate collisions. And in addition to the faster the object, the less time the game has to render objects in front of it as well. In Space Engineers 1 is just an example. Going double the speed limit of 100 meters a second to 200 meters a second cuts the time that the game has to render stuff in half. In addition, there comes a point where ships are so fast that it makes combat impossible because they outrun all of the ammo all of the time. Generally, in Space Engineers 1, you can exceed the speed limit by a little bit without there being too many issues, but it's not something that I'm going to advise in the long run, especially if people don't know what they're doing. A speed boost of 100 meters a second on top of the normal 300 meters a second, I would imagine, would be for, let's say, 10 seconds and take 120 seconds to fully recharge. Of course, we could adjust those numbers up or down. And for the boost itself, I would imagine that it's going to scale down to no less than 50 meters a second at max speed for super heavy ships and objects. Kind of like how the formula for jump drives scales the effectiveness of the drive down the heavier it gets, down to the minimum of effect of the drive. So you're always going to get some kind of effect from the jump drive. Likewise, I would assume that it's a similar thing for this. Now, I do not, and I repeat, do not agree with limiting the native cruise speed of ships even further. If 300 meters a second is the max, then in my personal opinion, all ships should be able to reach that speed at the minimum, with the smaller ships being able to get there and decelerate from said speed faster than the larger ones. Now, something like this, where we're talking about limiting the cruise speed of certain larger ships versus smaller, is something that is best accomplished at the individual server level, where a server setting can be given to admins to reduce the speed limits of ships above certain weights, or to limit cruise speed in general. And something like this, anyway, shouldn't be on by default, just like limiting the amount of weapons that an individual grid can have isn't turned on by default in Space Engineers 1. Now, while the numbers given for the cruise limit are fairly respectable, if one were to ever be implemented, that Diggrok brings up here, I would do it as 280 for big ships, 290 for medium, and 300 for smaller ones if I were to ever use one. Now, that may not seem like a lot in the grand scheme of things, but as travel goes on, and especially as you take that temporary boost into account, that's going to add up really quick and can cause some interesting results. Getting into some of the other ways to help people survive I'm really glad that he mentioned some of this stuff, is Diggrok gets into some potential active defense systems and some of the forms that they could take. Some of the stuff he mentions is things like the Iron Fist and explosive reactive armor, and some of the other potential things that could come up for this. So, some of the things he mentions, again, is like the Iron Fist system that detects incoming objects and launches intercepting ordnance that explodes near the incoming projectiles to detonate them so that they don't do any damage. Another good example of this is the Iron Dome that's used by Israel. As anytime it detects, incoming rockets or missiles, it fires up another little smaller rocket that detonates near that and hopefully allows that rocket to be destroyed without causing any damage. Some other examples of this are lasers that can pinpoint target drones or missiles and detonate them from a distance. Another example of stuff that Diggrok talks about is ablative armors, or otherwise known as reactive armors that, they countercharge the incoming projectiles. And then, of course, shorter range turrets that could potentially target incoming fire. So, some of my thoughts on that stuff are this. So, systems like the Iron Fist or the Iron Dome could be accomplished right now by giving turrets a setting to enter a defensive mode, if we want to call it that. And whenever they detect something incoming, they fire, a countercharge or a counter ordnance in order to detonate it. If it's caught in time and there's not too many projectiles, then in real life, the Iron Dome and the Iron Fist can be fairly effective. Gameplay-wise, I would imagine that it would use a missile to shoot down a missile, and one of the things to watch for is that could potentially lead to some performance issues if you've got too many explosions going off in one area. Now, I would imagine that if the two missiles, smack into each other, or they get close enough to each other like that to where they're going to hit, they would just delete each other in reality. But we might see a little visual effect of an explosion to simulate the detonations. Now, the more checks per second that the game has to run, the more likely you are to run into potential issues and potential lag and so forth. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't have more stuff going on. It just means that it's something you don't want to overdo. Now, some examples of some other stuff that we could potentially have that Diggrok mentions a little bit about that I also think could be very cool is he mentions chaff and decoys. Now, one of the things I will say is that we already have decoys now in game, and in my book, we could buff their effectiveness to further draw fire towards themselves versus their effectiveness now. An interesting interaction that I would do with Chaff, if I was to do it, is I would let Chaff operate as a temporary decoy that gives similar effect to the permanent static decoys, causing the turrets to target the Chaff briefly and make them not as effective, and fool the opposing turrets into thinking that the target is elsewhere. Now, this could be done with or without a heat system if they're done as a temporary decoy style effect. And this would have the effect of causing Gatlings and similar, of course, to target the decoys. But that doesn't have to be a bad thing. Now, Chaff could be slightly more effective than the permanent decoys due to its temporary nature and to make it worthwhile. Just again, to give a number to quantify, I would say make the Chaff 10 to 15% more effective than the static permanent decoys. It's not enough to nullify the permanent decoys by any stretch of the imagination, but it is enough that there's going to be a difference. And this could run into situations where people could choose whether they want to use Chaff exclusively, which would allow them to save some weight by carrying Chaff charges and potentially get better control over when the effect is used for the trade-off of not having as many charges and needing to reload. Or maybe they could utilize the permanent decoys for more weight overall and less effectiveness, but a constant protection, while active or until they're destroyed. I would imagine that the chaff time would be 10 to 15 seconds of use per charge with a 7-second downtime before another charge can be fired. And I would imagine that each chaff burst would contain around 3 or 4 chaff balls, to kind of somewhat emulate real-life versions of it. Now, one thing I would say is that permanent decoys would be like they are now in Space Engineers 1, but improved to have greater effect. They would be slightly less effective than the temporary chaff, but you're still going to get that constant potential protection until it's either destroyed at the cost of a little bit of extra consistent weight. Now, some of the other stuff is the laser anti-missile systems that we could maybe see, which would work as they do in real life now. They pinpoint target missiles, zapping them out of the air for the cost of some energy. Now, to avoid performance issues, I would have it so that if the laser actually hits the missile, then it's just going to delete the missile, leaving maybe a small little visual indicator behind, purely for aesthetics purposes. And to avoid them nullifying missile effectiveness outright, I would tie them to a battery capacitor maybe, that's good for so many shots before it's got to recharge itself, similar to some of what we have in real life. Now, the capacitor would be an internal battery type effect that's internal to the turret. Now, alternatively, if people wanted to, they could tie it to a dedicated battery that is then treated as the capacitor for that turret. Now, the thing that we would have to watch for is to avoid exploits with infinite battery or nigh-infinite batteries being used, is you would need to have a small cooldown between laser shots for the system to quote-unquote rescan and reacquire the targets, or however you want to say it. Then we have our short-range, high-fire turrets. Now, these could be done somewhat now with what we have already if we repurposed the internal turret-type weapons, or at least allowed for them to be purposed for that. Now, in Space Engineers 1, I've seen quite a few people that have used the internal turrets at some point to try and shoot down missiles, even though it's not necessarily the most effective method. A smaller defensive turret could be adopted or created for this purpose if we didn't want to use the interior turrets, or again just importing the interior turret and giving it a defensive mode type of option. This brings us to the ablative or explosive reactive armor. Now, while this is definitely a viable real-world solution to being hit by explosive charges, whereas you can kind of see how this works here in the little graphic that Diggrok provided. There's essentially two layers of it. There's the inner layer, and then there's the outer layers, which the outer layer is like two plates, and then between those two plates is like some kind of explosive material. And then whenever something hits that outer layer, it detonates that explosive charge and also detonates the incoming projectile, and like their forces cancel each other out. Like I say, there's a little bit more to the math and explanation than that, but that's the basics. Now, the downside to a material like this is it's only going to be a single time use, as far as that would go. And I'm not sure that something like that would be the most viable thing as a mechanic for SE, at least from a mechanic's standpoint. Due to how Space Engineers operates currently, it would likely be in a state of, or a constant state of losing and replacing or repairing components, which is going to lead to potentially massive performance issues if there's too much repairing, going on all at once. Now, to avoid the constant repair and destruction all the time, all in one go, it could be treated as the armor having an ammo capacity of sorts. Now, the ammo being an explosive charge that would have to be loaded by a welder or similar. Now, an issue I see is that depending on how much it takes to detonate the explosive part, this could detonate right away from just like one little glancing blow or one or two hits, and then be nigh useless the rest of the time. And that's especially true at the rate of fire some of these SE weapons can put out there, and especially the more of them there are. Now, some of the other stuff we're going to look at for the possible active defense systems, this is something that was brought up, is electronic warfare, which is essentially something you activate and it could blind the AI turrets. Now, in my book, this is an automatic no-go because it would be way too overpowered, and it would essentially shut off the turrets of an opponent and remove their ability to defend themselves completely, and could potentially give an automatic I win button to whoever executes this first. The other problems is this would be abused very heavily and would be a griefer's, shall we say, very fun dream, to put it mildly, and to put it in a more PG way. Now, this could be used to bypass weapon defenses of offline players and basically give a free key to the castle to griefers and people who like to offline raid. The other issue I have with it is that it can harm the grid of another person with a single click while the other person has no counter to it. You just click it and they're pretty much up the creek. There's no action and counteraction dynamic like there is with things such as turrets versus decoys and chaff. The decoy and chaff just misdirects some of the fire, makes you waste a little bit of ammo, but it doesn't outright remove your ability to fight back like completely blinding the turrets would do. Now, the decoys and chaff, again, just mean you're going to spend a little more ammo than you might otherwise do so. And the other thing, too, with electronic warfare is there's no preparation in a block like this. You just press the button once you get close, and you forget it. Another thing that was brought up is potentially small proximity EMPs, which, to Diggrok's credit, he does admit could potentially be a bad idea, and I'm going to go ahead and say, with all due respect, good sir, because I'm sure you may see this at some point. Yes, that is a very terrible idea. And also in my book is an automatic no-go, because that's going to be even worse than electronic warfare would be. Is because whereas electronic warfare would only blind the turrets, an EMP shuts off everything electronic on a ship, potentially. And electronic warfare would not only blind the turrets, but it would otherwise leave a... getting a little tongue-tied here. Electronic warfare would only blind the turrets, but would otherwise leave a player in control of their ship so that they could try to dodge fire until the electronic warfare effect ends, or they could perhaps boost away or try to execute a jump drive to get out of range, or try to tank shots with armor and shields until it comes back up. An EMP, on the other hand, is going to shut everything down and absolutely does give an automatic "I win, you're dead" button to whoever gets that EMP off first. And the EMP shutting off everything means a player loses all control over their ship, and they have no way to fight back at all, with no counter to it whatsoever. It's a single button click that basically allows people to shut off their opponent's entire grid and cause massive active harm by purely existing, which is something that not even Gatlings or missiles can do by purely existing. With EMPs, again, there's no back and forth dynamic. It's either you get hit or you don't. And if you do get hit, you're dead. Like with electronic warfare blocks, it's a press once and you forget it. Once you get close and you get an automatic win. Even if, say, it's only a 20 or 30 second thing, a lot can happen in that time, as that's 20 or 30 seconds of a grid getting pounded with no means of defense or repair that, to keep it going at all. A little bit more on this kind of stuff as to why I oppose these kind of things is EMPs and electronic warfare items fall into the same category as jump inhibitors that can, turn off an opponent's jump drives purely by being too close. Now, jump inhibitors are also another thing that is an automatic no-go in my book, because they harm another person's grid purely by existing with no way for that person to fight back at all. And again, blocks like this would be nothing but a griefer's dream. And they're going to be salivating at the idea of getting a hold of blocks like this to use on a victim or nuke somebody's base, just to be a jerk, to put it bluntly. And if the goal is to try to expand survival, then things like jump inhibitors, EMPs, or electronic warfare blocks defeat the purpose of trying to extend survival, because this just shortens it. And not only this, but in my book, jump inhibitors would only exist to allow griefing and toxicity. There is no legitimate purpose for something like that in game. And if a block like this were to ever be implemented, like whether it's an EMP or an electronic warfare thing that just automatically blinds the turrets, or especially a jump inhibitor, that is automatically going on the disabled list for me. And if there were countermeasures that Keen or whoever implemented for such blocks like this, I'm going to mod the ever-living crap out of it so that they're 100% effective, and it makes EMPs, electronic warfare, and jump inhibitor blocks completely useless. And it makes them a waste of space. Because in my book, stuff like that has zero place in Space Engineers. Now, if the goal, again, is to make combat more survivable and fair, blocks of that nature run counterproductive to that, in addition to making it harder or downright impossible for solo players to even play at all or operate. At that point, because of what those blocks are and the very nature of them, you may as well just give everybody a GTA-style hacker menu and call it a day and tell everybody to have fun. Now, I'm going to say, despite my tone, I don't fault Diggrok for making the suggestion of EMPs or electronic warfare type blocks. He's doing like a lot of us have done. He tosses stuff out there. Does this work? Does it not? And my gripe isn't with him at all. My gripe is with the toxic players who would love to get their hands on something like that. And to me, even if EMPs, electronic warfare blocks, and jump inhibitors could be disabled, or even if they were left off by default, they should never, ever be allowed in Space Engineers as a default thing, because tools like that would be nothing but griefing instruments used to harass other players, even though some people would suggest, those things and be sincere in wanting them as, a thing and not try to be a jerk about it. So point being, it's just stuff like this. There's no counter to them. There's no interacting with them. And to me, it's bad game design whenever a feature could potentially, harm another person's grid purely by existing. It's just, I can't get behind that kind of stuff. Both as a player and somebody with dev experience. Now, getting into some of the other stuff that was talked about and some of the things with combat and survival. So I solved some of my survival issues in my worlds through a bunch of different means. Now, by no means have I solved everything, but I've made it a lot better for myself and, some of my friends and everybody than it would be otherwise. And some of the ways I did this was through basic armors and reinforced components. Specifically, I created my DuraMax armors and my DuraMax reinforced blocks to address durability and survival concerns. And I mentioned these a little bit in the previous video. So to give a little bit of background on it, my DuraMax armor comes in the original heavy variant, medium, and light variants. The light variant is 6 times more durable than the vanilla light armor, with a little bit of extra weight. Then there's the medium variant, which is 6 times more durable than vanilla heavy. And then there's the original heavy variant, which is 10 times the strength of vanilla heavy at a slightly higher weight. Now, I reached these durability values through a combination of 2 things, which are custom components with increased health values, and I also baked some damage resistance values into the blocks. And this allowed the blocks to not weigh like 10 times the amount of the vanilla armors, because in Space Engineers 1 at least, especially, each component is going to add so much health, and the way you add more health potentially is to add more components if you're not adding, something like a damage resistance value. So the custom components that I used are the DuraMax grid, the DuraMax light grid, along with the DuraMax plate and DuraMax light plate. Now the light plate, or the light components, offer 6 times the health value, and regular DuraMax grids and plates offer 10 times the health value of their respective components. Vanilla light armor in-game is pretty much exclusively steel plates, and the vanilla heavy armor is steel plates plus metal grids. And having the 4 custom components can also allow me to mix and match as desired for the armor, but also for some of the reinforced variants of things like maybe turrets, antenna, or similar. To make it so that the DuraMax armor doesn't just get too far out of control, and it's not like, that's all they ever use all the time, and it just completely makes light armor and heavy stuff useless, I limited the DuraMax armor by introducing a custom Duron ore that can only be processed in special refineries that are dedicated exclusively to it, and it takes a while to process the stuff. There's also 2 types of refineries. There's the basic era refinery and the advanced era refinery. The advanced era refinery being able to use up to 3 upgrade modules. And now, if you're using the full 2125 era mod, the era refineries will also process other ores from the mod in addition to the Duron ore, like my Zabrium ore for my Zabrium power sources that give more power than standard uranium. Now, Zabrium can also be converted between its energized and depleted variants for use in ammo to emulate things like depleted uranium rounds in real life. And the Duron ore is something that I wrote lore-wise as being an exotic material discovered around the early 2100s that can be combined with other stuff to make it a lot harder, like we would create different metal alloys in real life. Then there's another component that I introduced, which is the DuraMax reinforced glass, which, just like it sounds, is glass panes that are stronger than normal that I used mainly for the express purpose of making reinforced cockpits and also some reinforced windows. The DuraMax glass is 4 times stronger than the standard glass components, and my DuraMax reinforced cockpits are ballpark around 4 times stronger than the vanilla cockpits, sometimes a little bit more depending on what the component cost comes out to be. The DuraMax reinforced weapons are limited to the light variants of the components, so they have a little more durability to let people fight a little bit longer, but it's not like completely overpowered. Now, overall, the changes are meant to allow people to survive in fights longer and not be completely screwed over by just a single shot. So, getting into the 2125 era mod, this for me was my answer to a lot of the issues that I had with Space Engineers 1, and I may end up porting this to Space Engineers 2 as well, depending. So, the era mod is meant to be just that, as far as the lore goes. It's set later in the era of Space Engineers 1, which is how I justify a lot of the changes that I do. You know, the era mod changes the scaling of certain items, you know, buffing their survival while balancing weapon damage against the new area-appropriate weapons. Sorry, getting a little tongue-tied. Anyway, the armor and stuff is balanced around the new era-appropriate weapons, with the weapons themselves being 10% to 33% stronger than vanilla weapons, respectively, from ground equipment to large grid weapons and so forth. I also included new thrusters, new power sources, new weapons, new antennas and stuff, and so forth. I also include additional variants of blocks that aren't available in vanilla, such as I have large grid autocannons that I use sometimes. Now, some of the effects of this mod have allowed me to take fighters against vanilla craft, such as the heavier Factorum ships, and, you know, win the fight, or at least survive long enough to retreat if necessary. I've also taken a 2125 fighter against a 2125 capital ship, which is doable if the pilot is good enough, and the fighter is good enough, but it's a lot harder to do. Now, the DuraMax armor itself, even though it's a lot stronger than the vanilla stuff, it's not invincible and can be breached easily enough despite how it might sound. So the mod itself is based around single block versus single block performance, meaning that the baseline balance assumes that you're pairing one block against another singular block, and after that it's an arms race. So, for example, in determining durability, a large grid DuraMax armor cube, meaning the large cubes on the large grid, can tank 8 shots from a single large grid vanilla railgun and 7 shots from my buffed variant that I created. Now, that may seem like it's overpowered, but keep in mind a couple of things. This assumes that only a single weapon is firing. The armor can be breached a lot faster if you bring additional guns to the fight. And very rarely in Space Engineers do people only bring one gun to a fight. There's often a lot more than that. And it's all going to add up very quickly. So if you have 2 railguns firing at our cube, it's still the same amount of shots, only the cube is going to get dismantled in half the time now. If you bring 1 railgun, 1 Gatling, and 1 assault cannon, that's going to add up even faster. And a lot of times, people innocently enough forget that adding additional weapons to the mix is going to grow the damage output exponentially. If you've only got a single Gatling firing, you've got normal damage. If you've got 2 Gatlings firing, you've doubled the damage output in the DPS. If you've got 3 Gatlings, you've tripled your damage. If you've got 4 Gatlings, you've quadrupled the damage, and so forth. You're growing it exponentially, and from there, it's just a numbers game and an arms race. If people want to get through the armor quicker, they can bring more guns and increase their DPS. If people want to survive longer, they can add more armor and potentially use welders to back that armor up. Now, in order to balance things from a balance perspective for a game like Space Engineers, you have to balance around single block versus single block and go from there. Because assuming that there were no technical limits, just for sake of discussion, you could have an infinite combo of blocks and infinitely large grids duking it out. And this is all before you ever take into account factors like piloting and tactics and things that can further alter an outcome. It's impossible to account for every single combo of things that could exist, short of having a higher level being like Q from Star Trek, or someone with access to the Infinity Stones, or somebody that's made a wish on the Dragon Balls, giving us a code, that can account for every single thing. To account for everything, the only viable course of action is to balance around single block versus single block, and then let players decide how much of each of those blocks they're going to bring to the table. If you bring 1 block of armor, that's going to get you X in terms of durability. If you bring 2 blocks, that's going to get you 2 times X. If you bring 3 blocks, that gets you 3 times X, and so forth. Now for the weapons balance, I started with a single cube of armor versus a single railgun. And I decided how many shots I wanted it to withstand before it broke, and then I adjusted the math accordingly. Same was done for that singular cube versus a Gatling gun, and that cube versus missiles, and so forth. If I felt that certain weapons were too strong or too weak, then I would adjust those numbers as necessary during testing. Maybe I increase the armor a little bit, decrease the weapon, maybe I decrease both, increase both, it just kind of depends. But overall, time that I've spent developing the 2125 mod at the time of this video is around about 300 hours or so at this point in its existence, maybe a little bit higher than that. And another thing as well is for the sensor array blocks that I mentioned before, with ranges of 15 kilometers to 4 kilometers for large and small grids being present respectively. This also allows for decent warning distances so that I'm going to know something is coming before it gets to me. I'm going to see it. There is no ifs, ands, or buts about it with the way that the 2125 mod is now. So, in order to achieve balance, there's certain things you've got to ask. Now, combat balance itself can mean different things to different people. What one person considers to be balanced and fair, another person might not. Now, the most concise definition for combat balance means that ideally, all of the weapons and all of the armors are in a Goldilocks zone of damage versus durability, where nothing is too strong and nothing is too weak, and it's just right. Of course, see the Goldilocks and the Three Bears thing for real-life inspiration for this. But to balance items, again, you have to use singular block performance, as you can't guarantee how many of each block will always be present. If you balanced everything around 10 Gatling guns being present, you're going to have people saying, well, why didn't you use 5, or why didn't you use 15, or why didn't you use, such and such number? And it's just going to be a never-ending headache, pretty much. Now, you know for sure that if a block is present, like if a weapon is present, there's going to be at least one of that weapon, even if it's the only one. You know that if a block is getting attacked, there's at least one of them there. The only consistent thing you can count on when dealing with this many possibilities is having at least one of a specific block present. Now, to balance the items, you have to decide how much damage you want it to be able to take before it fails, such as my having my large grid DuraMax armor cubes being able to withstand 8 vanilla railgun hits or 7 modded railgun hits before they fail. From that point, it's up to the players to decide how best to achieve that kind of damage and how they want to get there to take out all of that extra health. Now, when developing content for games, you've got to be able to answer the following questions in, of course, no particular order, which are first and foremost, why would I ever want to go to this map, use this item, or interact with this NPC? What purpose does this item, map, or system serve? What's the form that it's going to take? What negatives does it give me? And what positives does it give me? Now, to kind of elaborate on this a little bit more, so for the first question of why would you want to use that map, you know, you need to answer, well, why would somebody want to go there? Is there some kind of objective there? Is there some kind of resource? Is, some kind of item there? If it's an item, why would they want to use it? What does the item, give them? Why would they want to interact or not interact with that NPC? As far as purpose goes, why does it exist? What is its goal? If it's a weapon, type item, why would they want to use that weapon instead of this one over here? What reason does this map or item or system, exist for in game? What's its purpose? Can you accomplish your goals without that item or object or going to that map? Or is it an essential thing? When it comes to form, how is this map or this item or this NPC going to manifest itself in the game? What form does it present itself in? If it's a weapon type item, are we talking about a gun or a sword or a magic type of weapon? Just like there's a lot of types of swords in real life, like there's the katana, there's the long sword, there's the saber, there's the Scottish claymore, and, similar types of stuff, with sword being the general term to cover all of them. There can be a lot of variants of specific objects in game. When you're defining the negatives, you need to be able to define, like, what challenges does it present? What are the potential downsides that, implementing that map or that item or that NPC is going to do? What are the trade-offs in exchange for the positives that it gives? So think the opposite side of the coin to question 5, which, speaking of question 5, what positives does that map give you? What positives does that NPC and item give you? What ways does it make something better? What are the upsides in exchange for the negatives? Think again, the opposite of question 4 in this instance. Now, with all the questions, you need to think them through thoroughly to their logical conclusions and be as consistent and specific as you possibly can be. It doesn't have to be thought out to the exact last 1 and 0 of the binary code straight out of the gate, but it does need to be fully analyzed. Far too often, people stop at just surface level answers and thought processes when dealing with questions like this. And an example of this is a comment where a user tried to answer these questions on the Keen site and on my heat management video in the comments section. Now, again, I'm not ripping on the guy. I'm just using this stuff as examples. So, to his answer for question 4, which is what negatives does it give? He talks about it being a slight performance overhead, but not significant. To question 5, of what positives does it give? He says more interesting engineering choices and better overall combat balance. And then to the question of form, he says some blocks generate heat and transfer it to the hull passively dissipates it into space. So again, this is not meant to be a dig at that guy that responded. I appreciate that response and his attempts to try to engage with it, but with all due respect to him, those answers are surface level at best. They don't tell me any of the nitty-gritty about how that stuff would work. For question 4, it doesn't tell me, what are we calling a slight overhead? That's very ambiguous. It doesn't give me anything specific to work with. When answering the question about positives, it doesn't tell me how it's going to provide those interesting choices or better overall balance. It simply gives me an overview outline instead of getting into the nitty-gritty. And then for the answer regarding the form of the blocks, okay, how does it transfer the heat to the hull? Does it do it passively? Does it need pipes? Does it need both? Does it happen by magic? Whatever. I give the guy props for trying to answer, and it's not a shot at him, but super vague answers don't adequately answer the questions and allow people to really prepare for anything. Now, the issue as well is if I'm the creator of said hypothetical map, non-player character, item, or so forth, and I can't give good enough reasons for players to want to interact with those things or visit that location or so forth, I can't expect them to magically come up with it either. For the user in question, answers like that give me a rough idea of what he wants to accomplish, but it doesn't tell me how he wants to accomplish it. It doesn't tell me how he's going to get there. It's kind of like a business proposal where a person is being, tasked with getting a potential investor to invest in a project, but not adequately explaining when, how, or why their money is going to be used and what kind of a return they can expect on the investment. It doesn't mean that the proposal is malicious or there's any kind of deception or anything below board going on. It just means that it's incomplete and there needs to be more elaboration on the subject. Now, getting into energy shields finally, I want to touch base on some of the misconceptions that a lot of people have about energy shields, and I believe that can throw a lot of people off when it might not otherwise do so. And we're going to talk about some of the fatal flaws that the two more common types of shield mods have, and some of the misconceptions that people in the community get because of those fatal flaws, and why just porting one of these particular mods will not work on its own. So first up, we have Scython's Energy Shields. Now this is the original shield mod that was created way back in 2015 for Space Engineers 1. It's a skin type of shield that covers the ship, and it doesn't extend out like a bubble type of shield. It doesn't use facings like defense shields or similar projects do. A hit on the shield is a hit on the shield regardless of where it is. The baseline shield health is so many points, and so many points regenerating per second. The health and regen rate is different based on the size of the shield block and whether any kind of upgrades are being used or not. It comes in the large and small variants for large and small grids, meaning you get 2 sizes per grid. It can be placed internally or externally. The large grid variants can be further augmented by the upgrade modules I mentioned before, allowing a user to upgrade the shield capacity or the shield regeneration rate, or both, depending on how you use the upgrade slots, but it's going to cost you a heck of a lot more energy to do so. In addition, when this is first charging up, it can be a very big energy hog. If the shielded grid splats into something, this is a complaint I've seen people talk about. If it splats into something at full throttle, like a voxel or so forth, the shield can absorb the impact and prevent damage to the ship. This, of course, can be disabled, but it's turned on by default. Another problem is it can be stacked near infinitely by adding additional shield units and additional power. It's a place, charge, and forget type of thing, with no other manual control required beyond this. The thing that does kind of suck is there's not a UI baked into the ship controls for the health. You only really get shield color that's viewable whenever it's getting hit, and some information that you can view in the terminal and broadcast to an LCD that requires more setup. Then you have defense shields, which is the other really popular one. It's the signature shield of the Weapon Core Framework mod. It requires you to use the Weapon Core mod, meaning that it's a full rework of the combat system to the standards of the mod. It's going to be incompatible with vanilla weapon systems. The shield is a bubble type of thing instead of a skin. The shield can also be limited in power that it's allowed to suck up, which it can be limited to kilowatts, megawatts, gigawatts, and I think somebody said they added terawatts recently too, but I'm not gonna vouch for that completely. But point being is that this can completely drain the power of a ship if the incorrect value is used. Now it requires a controller block and an emitter in order to use it. The emitters have to be placed on the outside of the ship typically. It also has shield facings. Allies and foes can bypass the ship's shields if they know the frequency modulation. This can, of course, be changed to kind of prevent that from happening. The enhancer modules that are available can further alter the effectiveness of the shields. Another thing is it can overheat due to built-in mechanics and lead to a recharge loss, which can be somewhat negated with different modules. It can allow shield penetration Potentially, the more the shield gets damaged, allowing stuff to potentially bleed through. In addition to this, you can also configure the shield to be more effective against energy damage or kinetic type damage, since Weapon Core allows for energy type weapons to be readily crafted. And it requires a lot more manual control to get the full effects of the shields overall. Now again, these are just the basic forms as a quick overview. So, some of my thoughts on this. Now, I would dare say that these are two very iconic mods in the community. However, they both have very massive fatal flaws that influence many people to think shields would need to be more complicated or harder to balance than they actually are and would be. Now, people forget that these two mods are simply the interpretation of individual modders and are not the only ways to implement shield systems. Now, some of the fatal flaws are that both of these shield types can be stacked near infinitely by either adding more power or potentially adding additional shield modules, whichever one it takes. Point being, if you have enough modules and enough power, you're never getting through the shields. Nothing is ever getting through the shields at that point. Now, with sufficient shield modules and power, they can completely invalidate smaller ships and make them completely useless, just because they're never going to be able to compete with the larger vessels. Now, shield health on both types scales way too high in some instances with the larger ships, and way too low with the smaller ones. I do expect a larger ship to generally have an advantage with what it can do shield-wise, but the scaling is still way off. In addition to this, defense shields overly complicates the mechanic where it doesn't need to, such as demanding manual control in areas that are best left to automation. On the opposite side of that coin, Scythons doesn't also provide some of the information that it should in a readily accessible way, and it requires a lot of extra steps to get to some of that information. Now, due to these flaws, a lot of people think that all shields, regardless of what form or fashion they're implemented, would have these same flaws. And they fear that the scaling is going to go too high or too low. And I can kind of see why they think that. I can understand why people would be afraid of that. Now, another thing as well is a lot of people think you've got to balance around the shields always being present on a grid, and you just don't. I'm sorry, but you don't. You either have the shield or you don't. More on this in just a minute. So, getting into some of the final misconceptions, like I was saying, is there's some people that think you've got to balance around the shields always being there, even though you don't have to do that. Again, you either have the shield or you don't. If you have the shield, or if you don't have the shield, you're not going to benefit from it. If you have the shield, you're going to benefit from it. Now, when balancing a single armor cube versus a single weapon, as a prime example, I'm not going to take a non-present shield into account because it's irrelevant. Regardless of whether a shield is present or not, every single block still needs to have a baseline health value and be defined as to how much damage it can take before it's destroyed. Shields don't remove this requirement. All they do is add an additional layer between the block and the weapon that has to be removed first before the block underneath can take damage. It's akin to having an additional layer of armor in front of our previously mentioned hypothetical cube. To balance that cube, I'm going to answer how many hits I want it to take before that singular weapon breaks it and adjust the math accordingly. The shield, in that instance, is an outside blocker system that requires a separate degree of balance versus that weapon. Similarly to the cube, I'm going to decide how much damage I want it to be able to take before it fails, and then I'm going to adjust the math of the shield accordingly. If I have a cube and a shield present, the shield is the first line of defense, with the armor block being the second. The weapon has to breach both before it can get to what's underneath. Functionally speaking, there is no difference between a shield adding extra health to stop a block from being destroyed and welders constantly repairing said block with new components. The only thing that changes is the form that the extra repair or extra health comes in. The shield is kind of like a phone case, protecting your phone, with the phone's outer shell protecting the components underneath. You've got 2 layers of defense there. The shield and the welder in this instance, or the shield and that welder, are eating a resource to keep that cube alive. The only question is what the resource is and how much of it's being spent. The shield's eating energy, the welder is eating components. Now, in addition to this, whenever a shield is properly implemented, it's not an automatic I win button. It's simply an extra layer of armor that's basically just in a different form. Now, assuming that shields aren't being allowed to scale to infinity and beyond, pun intended, of course, the thing I would say is if the only difference between you winning and losing is said shield in that instance, that tells me that there's more than just that shield, being present. That tells me that perhaps either your build or piloting aren't good enough, their build and piloting is better than yours, you need to change your tactics, or perhaps all of it. A shield on its own should not make that big of a difference. And if it does, you need to go back to the drawing board. Now, some people say that shields allow bad builds to succeed and be viable where they shouldn't. Now, if that bad build is beating you, that quote-unquote bad build is beating you all the time, that tells me that build isn't as bad as you think it is. See previous example of needing to change your piloting, build, and or potentially tactics. Also, I don't buy this argument because who gets to decide what is a bad build and what isn't? Honestly. If somebody is putting all their eggs into one basket anyway and relying exclusively on the shields, then that makes it easier for me to beat them. And all you have to do at that point is breach the shields and they're done. They're up the creek. So, I don't see why people would complain about that when somebody's making it easier for you to beat them. Now, I get that some folks think shields would feel too sci-fi for a game like Space Engineers, and that's a valid complaint. However, I would also argue that if something being too sci-fi is a concern, there are far, far worse offenders out there than just shields. Now, gravity generators and jump drives are certainly examples of this, as we don't have a means to do either one currently. However, those are the low-hanging fruit on the tree here. The real worst offender for a sci-fi type block is the small grid, small reactor. It's a 0.5 meter cube, or roughly 18 inches when you convert from meters to inches. That's a fully self-contained reactor that generates no waste, has its own cooling system, and can be operated by your average Joe. And it could power a modern, American or European house for an entire year or longer off of a single load of fuel. And while I understand some people prefer more realism, I would argue that that ship has long since sailed with the SE franchise. And if people are just that opposed to shields, people could just turn them off like they can with the pressurization, or mod the shields to your liking. But if increasing survival is the goal, then the option needs to be considered. There's no harm in servers having the option, and it can always be disabled or modded if people desire. Okay, now we're going to get into some of the fun stuff, which is how I would personally design and balance the shields. And to start with this, we're going to look at some of the background inspiration that I would draw from, as well as goals for the shield system. So first up, the goal for the shield system is to provide a balanced defensive layer that's easy to use, but doesn't repeat the mistakes or flaws of other shield systems. I would borrow some elements from games that have successfully struck a balance between ship and shield health, like Star Trek Bridge Commander has been able to do. I would also borrow some elements from games like Star Trek Online as an example, to bring some variety to the shields, and so they're not just a one-trick pony, along with utilizing some of the UI elements that work. Now in Star Trek Bridge Commander or Star Trek Online, the shields are divided into facings, so it's not all just one big lump of, whatever you want to call it. There's the left, right, forward, and rear facings, And then Bridge Commander has those same facings, but also has a top and a bottom shield facing on top of those. Now, in these games, the ships have a total amount of health that is divided among the facings. A shield could have 120,000 points of total value, for example, but each of the facings is going to carry some of that value. In Stow, each of the shields would have a value of 40,000 points. You take the 120k, you divide that by 4, that gets you 40k a facing. In Bridge Commander, they would have 20k. You take the 120k, you divide that by 6, that gives you 20k per facing. In Bridge Commander, if and when the shields failed, you had to rely on the hull and your ability to dodge incoming fire and pilot your ship. Now, Bridge Commander allows you to focus repairs on a few systems at once, or a few items at once, but it limited you to how many you could repair, with the repair rate and the shield regeneration values being static. In Stow, however, since it's an MMO, it's a little bit different, as anytime you execute a repair, you're repairing systems as a whole. Your subsystems can never be turned off completely forever, or be destroyed like what can happen in Star Trek Bridge Commander. Now, in Stow, you can use various means to regenerate your shields faster. You can give them, more innate, faster regen on their own, or extra health. You can also direct energy from a stronger facing to a weaker one that's been damaged to try to recharge it some. And you could redirect that to an individual facing, or you could try to balance out the health overall. But regardless of which one you do, anytime you give the command to redirect, it's done automatically once you give the command. In Bridge Commander, whenever the shields are up, they stop 100% of the damage when they're operational, and if they're ever pushed towards the weaker side, or they eventually fail, then, and only then, will they let damage through. Now, in Stow, there's a bleed-through mechanic where shields stop 90% of the damage on average, with certain damage types like kinetic being even weaker to shields still, meaning 10% of the damage still gets through on average. Whereas Bridge Commander shields start regenerating instantly, and only to the damaged facings. Stow regenerates all facings by a certain amount every 6 seconds. If this regeneration would cause you to potentially overcap one of the facings, you only get the health back in the damaged facing. This is why in Stow, most people often try to balance the shield as they're taking damage, because that's going to get you more overall healing in the long run. In Stow, there's 4 base types of shield generator that you get to work with. There's more advanced reputation types that build on top of that can be unlocked later, or shields that are tied to set pieces that you can use a couple of pieces for to get extra bonuses from, and those are picked up in missions as well as elsewhere. For the purposes of this video, however, we're going to be focusing on the 4 base types. There's the normal shields, which are standard regen, standard capacity, and the standard 10% bleed through. There's the regenerative shields, which have a higher regen rate but lower overall capacity, and they have the 10% bleed through. There's the covariant shields, which are the lowest overall regen rate but have the highest overall capacity and a 10% bleed through. Then you have the resilient shields, which are the middle regen rate, the middle capacity. They have a 5% bleed through and a 5% absorb effect, meaning they shake off an additional 5% of that bleed through damage. In Stow, there's no designated quote-unquote best out of those shield types, as every single one of them has their place, especially when they're tied to set bonuses and reputations that you can gain later. For me, I would borrow elements from Bridge Commander and Stow shield systems to create shields for Space Engineers. As far as the science behind them goes, I would write it as them being an exotic matter state that's being called upon, that can pass through solid objects and take on properties of a solid whenever needed. We could see examples of this in real life, where there's certain exotic matter states that can allow stuff to pass through solid objects, but turn around and solidify again whenever necessary. So, getting into some of the basic form. There would be 3 types of shields in Space Engineers that I would implement, similar to Star Trek Online type of shields. I would borrow from the concepts of regenerative, covariant, and standard normal shields to create the nimble, capacitorium, and equipoise shields respectively. The nimble shield would have the higher regen but lower overall health, equipoise would have middle regen and middle health, and the capacitorium would have the lower regen but the higher overall health. The shields would block 100% of the damage while they're up. I wouldn't use a bleed through effect because to me that allows me to save on performance and give maximum survival potential to the shields. Also because I see a bleed through effect as being more trouble than it's worth and more intensive than any potential benefit. Now also this allows us to block tool damage from enemy players that are just trying to hydro man a ship to death. In addition to this, I would also give the players the ability to turn friendly tool damage on or off. I would bake that into the shields themselves so they're not having to constantly flip that back and forth in the world settings by going in and or going out and coming back in and so forth. Unlike Scython's shields, my shields would not block the damage by default if you splat into a ground or a voxel going at the speed of Mach Stupid. I would, however, give server owners the ability to enable this option and turn it on if they wished, if for no other reason than comedy's sake. If that setting gets turned on, the shields would eat a percentage-based damage depending on how fast the ship was going whenever they splat into something. So it would be off by default, but the server owners would have the ability to turn it on if they wished. The shields would utilize 6 facings, similar to Bridge Commander. The shield would also be a skin type of shield instead of a bubble to avoid some of the issues, such as people using the shield as a weapon to try and force people out of their grids or bases without having to fire a shot, as I've seen some people try to do by abusing the safe zone mechanics. It would also save a bit on performance, and it would also avoid issues and questions such as, can friendlies pass through the shield or not, and what happens if you have 2 shield bubbles that cross. Because, well, there's nothing to cross and there's nothing to pass through. It's just a skin that exists on the ship. Similar to Scython's shields, Bridge Commander, or Star Trek Online, there would be visual indicators of the facings flaring to show that they've been hit. It would be a visual effect that's just big enough to show an impact has occurred, while the effect wouldn't be overly large. It also ideally shouldn't block the view of the pilot, and I would allow this to be disabled if, one wished to do so. I would add some UI elements so that people could see the strength of the various shield facings, as well as some indicators to show if power is being transferred into a particular facing, or if the shields are trying to balance the remaining health out as a whole. The shields would have to charge themselves up for the first time to gain the full effect of them, just like if you were charging a battery for the first time. Once they reach full charge, they would be at full health. When the shield barrier is turned off or disengaged, the shield would store any remaining charge or health in an internal capacitor to be used again later, and it would also recharge any missing health while the block is gaining power. When the shield is at full, but not being hit, it's going to consume a smaller amount of standby power to maintain the barrier. If the shields are completely drained, the pilot could, for example, disengage the shields and allow them to focus on recharging and relying on their armor and piloting before flipping the shields back on. This would allow people to mimic scenes from Star Trek itself, such as in the DS9 episode Way of the Warrior, where Sisko turned off the Defiant shields to do battle with the Klingons and try to rescue Tatapa Council survivors before they faced off at DS9 itself. This also keeps the engineering of the ships more relevant by doing it this way, and giving an incentive to not always have them on. And then having the shields be up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down in a never-ending cycle. Now, while the shields are charging or they're regenerating, they would eat up 55% of the grid's total power. Regardless of how much power there actually is, it would always be 55% of the total available power. Now, this is also one of the safeguards that I would implement to prevent infinite shield stacking. There's going to be some other safeguards that I would implement on top of that. Now, the passive power consumption rate would be 15% of the grid's total power while it's active, once the shields are fully charged. The shields would turn on immediately if they have power and are charged with no spool-up time. The shields would need to charge fully to gain the maximum effect and protection of the shields. Assuming that the shields have power, they would require 2 minutes to fully charge up the first time as a baseline. Now, the shields would also have a hard capacity to their health, in part which would be determined by the scaling formula that they use and the different shield types. Now, there's going to be a little bit more on the formulas in just a moment. But redirecting power to the different shield facings or balance it out would also be possible via manual control, or could be automated using event controllers or similar. I would leave that up to the pilots and crew to determine what route is best for them. Okay, slight technical mishap there, but getting back into it, we're going to look at the formulas that I would use for potential scaling, as well as ways to prevent the shields from infinitely stacking. So to prevent the shields from being able to be infinitely stacked, I would limit the shields so that one can only have one of them per ship or grid, or effectively only benefit from one per grid. Now, I could hard code that so that one could only have a single shield generator on a grid, as in a physical shield block. The other option is I could allow people to have as many physical blocks on a grid as they want, but require them to mark one of the shields as a primary shield generator. If the primary shield is destroyed, then the grid would default to the next shield that is in line in terms of construction order, and that would become the new primary shield. This would be treated like a brand new shield generator, and it would need to charge itself up from zero. In addition, the shields would have a hard cap to their health, determined in part by which scaling formula they use and also their shield type. More on the formulas in just a second. So the scaling would also have a hard upper limit determined by one of two scaling formulas, either the universal or the differential. Servers would be able to choose which formula for the shields they want to use on their server to customize the experience, as the different formulas would be able to give radically different results. Some rough examples would be below. Now, the numbers used are quantifications purely for discussion purposes only, and the final numbers could and would likely be different. Now, the numbers and examples will assume equipoise shield type, just to make it simple. So for the differential formula, to determine the maximum health, it would look at the total health of the grid, then divide that among the shield facings. For example, a dreadnought could have 1.2 million total health, and that would give it 6 facings with 200k health apiece. A smaller fighter, for example, could have 120k total health, and divide that among the 6 facings, you get 20k per facing. If a weapon impacts a shield for 1,000 points of damage, it's going to eat different percentages of the shield based on the available health. Now, this favors beating the shield by pure raw firepower for this variant. It also drains shield health relative to how much damage a weapon produces versus the total health of the shield facing. Then there's the universal formula. The max health is determined by which type of shield a person picks. For example, a standard shield with 120,000 health would be the same for a giant dreadnought as it is for a fighter. Both of them would get the 120,000 points. All weapons would deal the same amount of damage to the shield baseline regardless of type, meaning that all Gatling type weapons would deal, say, 100 points of damage per hit regardless of ammo type used. Artillery type weapons would deal, say, 200 damage regardless of whether it's a 100mm shell or 200mm shell that impacts the shields. This is going to favor beating the shield by exhausting the damage events that it can stop, and it's going to drain the shields based on percentage and weapon type hitting it versus just pure raw firepower. Now, this is going to allow the different servers to pick their formula that would give them the greatest control and customization and allow them to choose whether they want to give larger ships an advantage and an edge or not, similar to larger ships having more shielding available in shows like Star Trek or similar, or if they want it to be a more universal type of thing, regardless of what's tagging it or what the size of the ship is. Now, when the shields begin regenerating, each damaged facing would regenerate 2% of its health every 3 seconds for a potential total regen of 12% of the total shield health every 3 seconds. While this may seem overpowered to people, keep in mind, for every bit of power that they redirect towards a damaged facing, they must pull power out of an undamaged facing, thus potentially weakening the other facings. Undamaged facings wouldn't regenerate, which incentivizes people to divert power and not keep it all in one place to get the extra healing. A lot can happen in those 3 seconds, especially if a particular shield facing actually fails. If you get enough shots through the universal scaling, or powerful enough shots through the differential, you could potentially zap that 2% away as soon as it comes back. So, further bits on the scaling, shield types, and block size. So, the equipoise shield type for this, just to illustrate what I'm talking about. Each damaged facing would regenerate 2% of its health per facing every 3 seconds, for a total of 12% overall capacity regenerated every 3 seconds. The total capacity would be the baseline health, determined by either the universal or the differential scaling formula. For the capacitorium shield type, each damaged facing would regenerate 1% of its health per facing every 3 seconds, for a total of 6% overall capacity regen. The total capacity, again, is the baseline health determined by the universal or differential scaling formula, plus an extra 25% health on top of that. For the nimble shield type, similar to the others, each damaged facing is going to regenerate, or each facing is going to regenerate 3% of its health per facing every 3 seconds, for a potential total maximum of 18% shield capacity regenerated every 3 seconds. The total capacity will be the baseline health, determined by either the universal or differential scaling formulas, minus 25% to the total health for the final value. As far as the physical block size, each shield would be a singular block that's a 2 meter by 1.5 meter by 1.5 meters in size, and it would draw power passively through the grid without requiring connection to conveyors, of course. The shield types would come as they are with no upgrade ports or similar. What you see is what you get. The physical models could be slightly different as far as cosmetic looks, depending on what variant a person is using. You may also see different colorations of their shield flares whenever the shield takes a hit. If the shield is hit on the border of 2 facings, which I would say is a very highly unlikely event, it could split the damage between the 2 facings, or just use the last closest facing to where it was hit. I would leave that part up to Keen, and, however their engine decides to solve that kind of thing. Now, in the event a facing doesn't have enough remaining health to fully absorb a weapon impact, it will take the following actions depending on the damage formula that is used. If a server is using the differential formula, if a shield only has enough health to stop 5,000 points of damage, but a 6,000 point impact has occurred, the shield would absorb the 5,000 points of damage and transfer the remaining 1,000 points to the block beneath the weapon impact. If it's the universal formula that's being used, and let's say a shield is down to 2%, and a weapon blast that's incoming would drain 3% of the shield is going to absorb what it can, and then it's going to transfer the remaining 1/3 of that weapon's damage to the block underneath it. Now, this would be a little bit more resource-intensive formula to run, most likely, because of a little bit of extra math in terms of calculating the percentages. Now, the shield generators would be an in-game type of block that requires some of your normal components, just like you would expect from regular blocks. However, the key components for the shields would be super expensive and harder to acquire and craft. It would require a pretty healthy amount of them. The people could maybe get lucky and pick up a few components from NPC stations here or there to scrape together a shield a little bit earlier, but that would be an uncommon to rare thing and certainly not the norm. Ideally, I would make them harder to craft, similar to my DuraMax armor. The components would require a specialty ore, and the component, or a specialty ore type component as part of its construction. The ore would be refinable by a custom refinery, and the component would be made at a custom assembler type. Now, I'm not sure how Keen would handle that particular part. They can maybe spread it out among the different crafting stations that exist if they didn't want to do an additional substation type. Or perhaps maybe they could add an additional, crafting station type that is meant for like advanced electronic type of stuff. Now, a caution to my fellow shield advocates. The shields are meant to be a potential first line of defense for in-game ships or an augment to existing defenses, depending on how you want to look at it. While they could be powerful, they are not meant to be the final and only solution to defense. The shields are only going to get you so far, and they're not going to save you if your ship isn't properly planned out. Should the shields be added, I advise you, do not rely on them alone. They're only one piece in the puzzle, just like armor and sensors and so forth are only one piece in the puzzle, and the equipment is only as good as how it's used. Some of the final thoughts that I would deal with here is, and I guess some of my final thoughts overall I should say, is, to me, combat in Space Engineers can be very fun or very frustrating depending on the situation, and can go from one end of that spectrum to the other very quickly. And Keen has gotten a pretty good start at making combat a lot better and addressing some of the criticisms and concerns. For some of my final thoughts on sensors, I like the idea of better variety in sensors, as it would allow people to not be caught by surprise as often as can happen now. It can allow people to know a foe is coming in advance. On the opposite side, it could potentially be used in a negative way depending on who's using it. But better detection has been needed for a while, and if it's structured in the right way, that it doesn't completely expose everyone, it'll be a great thing. As far as my thoughts on better armors, now this one has been needed for a while, like a long while, and this is the area where I believe that realism is going to be the hardest hit in favor of healthy gameplay, even more than adding energy shields would do. In reality, yes, it makes sense for the light armor and heavy armors to be easier to get through. If we were to make a real-life version of a cube block of Space Engineers armor, it would make sense for some of the things that we have in real life to get through easier, like we see in game. The problem with some of the armors in Space Engineers is that these ammos in game can make those armors seem like tissue paper, whether it's heavy armor or light armor, with light armor being more of a suggestion and a name than an actual reality. Now, I don't think anybody expects that the armor should be nigh invincible. However, if we want increases in survivability, the scaling of the armors has to change versus the weapons in game. Again, I solved this issue for myself with my DuraMax armor, and it's done well for my purposes, and I believe something similar would work great for SE2. Now, it doesn't have to be point for point exactly what I did, but the vanilla armors definitely need some drastic improvements. And it could be just as easily explained as them finding better and more exotic hardening materials once they reach the Almagest system. Same concept goes for stronger cockpits and such. Right now, the cockpits are way too weak as they are now, hence why, like I said, I made my DuraMax reinforced cockpits with the reinforced glass component. Now, personally, I believe that the weapons themselves are fine as they are, in terms of the damage output that they do usually. It's, to me, the scaling of the armor and the cockpit durability versus the weapons that leaves a lot to be desired and is the root problem. And sometimes, even though yes, it's realistic for those cockpits and some of the armors to pop as easily as they do right now. Sometimes realism needs to take a back seat to gameplay in order to have a healthy game. And to me, this is going to be one of those times. For some final thoughts on active defense systems, I like the idea of better decoys, and I like the idea of Chaff being used as temporary buffed decoys, as that opens up some new areas and build types that we've not seen before, and can allow people to make somewhat of a more true, jet fighter type of grid or build. Sometimes right now the decoys are more of a suggestion and they're not actually effective in SE1. Now, they don't need to be 100% effective, but they do need to be more effective than they are now. Even if, let's say, for sake of discussion, we stick them at being 50% effective, this would still be a drastic improvement to what we have now. They shouldn't be invincible, but they should at least be more effective than they are now until they're destroyed or you get close enough to the target in order for the turrets to realize, wait a second, that's not my target, that's a decoy, and then it reacquires. Now, it won't take much in this department to get the necessary improvements for the decoys, but the improvements that are made will be significant. Now, there's also the anti-missile lasers, and if they actually work and can shoot down some of the missiles, would be a gift from Clang himself. That is just chef's kiss on that thing that cannot be overstated, I should say. The target missile feature, with all due respect to Keen, is pretty much useless in SE1 as it sits currently. Then we come to shields. Now, I've wanted to see these added to SE1 and SE2 for a while now because I like the idea of being able to sci-fi my ships up a little more, just because to me that's fun. And I recognize that not everybody likes the thought of shields because they feel they're too advanced for the franchise. And I totally get that. This is why I always assume that when we're talking about big impact features like this, that they're able to be modded, very, very heavily, or even turned off, similar to the pressurization feature, and that each server could do what is best for them. While I believe that the two iconic shield mods, such as Scythons and Defense Shields, can be very good and can be a lot of fun, I also believe on the opposite side of that coin that they've skewed people's opinions and ideas on how a vanilla shield would have to work, and when it doesn't have to be that way or to repeat the same flaws that those mods have. Now, that's not a rip on the modders that made those mods. They did very, very good for what they have, and especially for the time in the case of Scython. And I acknowledge their work and have enjoyed it over the years. Now, simultaneously, I don't think that they're the best representations of what a shield system could or should be in something like Space Engineers. Now, as I've mentioned previously, I believe in some areas they overcomplicate things, and in some areas they don't do quite enough, and they're not thought out as well enough, such as some of the UI elements. Now, that said, if the goal is truly to increase survival in Space Engineers 2 and to try to balance combat more, shields have to be on the table as an option. It would be foolish to say one wants to increase combat survivability, but to completely ignore one of the more obvious solutions. Once the shields have been established, once we have the baseline, people can use them as they are, they can mod them, turn them off, or do whatever they need to do to their heart's content. Now, at the end of the day, I agree with Diggrok and others saying that combat needs a rework. We've got some pretty decent bones to work with, I would say, but they need to be fleshed out more. And Merrick is on the money when he says preparation should matter. All of these options, the shields, the active defense systems, the better armor, the better sensors, all of that stuff is going to allow people to better prepare for combat encounters than we can do now. Combat in SE2 and even in SE1 needs some polish, with SE1 showing its age a fair amount. It's still a great game, and SE2 will be as well. But they can be even better. Keen is never going to please everyone at the end of the day. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Which is why with all of these suggestions, the best that they can do is set a baseline, ship it off to the players, and make it an us problem on the player side. They can't prepare for every single outcome, but they can certainly give us some more tools to work with in the sandbox, which we've all been wanting for a while now. But anyway, folks, that brings us to the end of this video. I know, again, this is a rather long one. There's a lot of stuff that we needed to get through. I'm going to have timestamps for you folks. Let me know what you guys think down below. You know, what do you think about the different sensors? What do you think about having some more like radar and that kind of stuff? Do you think it's a good idea? Do you think it's not? What do you think about some of the active defense system ideas? Or adding, stronger, more durable armor? What do you think as far as shields go? In the positive or the negative? The only thing I ask, keep everything constructive and so forth, because at the end of the day, we all want space engineers to be as successful as possible. Where we might disagree to some extent is just how to get there. But anyways, folks, this is the end of the video. Let me know what you all think, and for now, folks, this is Captain Blade J52 signing off.